Okay, but income disparities are greater in other countries, especially in poorer countries, which is actually kind of counterintuitive. You would think the richer the country, the more unequal the income would be, but it turns out that's not true. So poor people in the US receive far more goods and services than the average household in most low-income countries. Not more than the equally poor fifth in those countries. They make more than the middle income people earn in low-income countries. That's because the United States is so wealthy that what we consider poor is not considered poor in other nations. Let's take a look at some of these numbers. Here we have the differences in the top 20% of what the income is in the world. You can see that the United States is somewhere in the middle, and South Africa has dramatically higher inequality. And as you go down, Namibia, Brazil has significantly more inequality than the United States. The United States has more than the United Kingdom, more than Japan, more than Canada, more than Germany, and Sweden is buried behind my picture. But that last green one is Sweden. They have the lowest level of inequality of the countries that are being listed here. So we can see that there's a great spread in the degree of inequality but in nations in the incomes of their people. So, can we eliminate global poverty? In my opinion, the answer is yes. Eliminating global poverty, we're already making tremendous strides at doing so. The poverty rate worldwide, as measured by the World Bank, has declined by more than half of all of the poor people in the world were taken out of poverty in the last 30 years or so. We're still leaving a significant number of people. We saw 3 billion people still left in abject poverty. But the number of people worldwide who have been getting out of poverty in countries that used to be abjectly poor, like China, like India, which have huge chunks of the world's population, those two countries are moving rapidly away from abject poverty, and mostly due to opening up their economies to more market orientation, providing better property rights, providing better legal systems, slowly by little, China making more advanced so far than India has on these issues, but both of them moving in that direction, whereas before they had been heavily government dominated, and unfortunately bureaucrats do a really, really bad job of building economies. At least that's been the historical knowledge that we have, that virtually all countries that have done well in the world economically are all market-oriented economies, and those countries that are very low on the list for market orientation, meaning that they're more government-oriented, they've all been poor and done very badly. So it seems to me that's a particularly important thing that we need to do. So anyway, on this list that the UN has come up with is a goal of reducing inequalities across income groups, gender, and race, protecting the environment, slowing climate change. They're all additional goals. Some of these goals may actually be in conflict with each other. If you're talking about slowing climate change by shifting to solar, when solar power is so much more expensive than coal-fired power, for instance, shifting to solar in a third world nation could actually slow down the economic growth. So we're going to see that whatever the UN, however noble the goals are, they may be proposing contradictory goals that work against each other. So can the world meet all these goals? Well, they can't meet them all simultaneously. Like I said, if you're going to be pursuing contradictory goals, you may run into some very serious problems. But I'm assuming that if the political will is there, and this again, how do you measure do leaders in poor countries want to change the system in order to open it up for more competition? Very unlikely. It turns out that political leaders in poor nations do quite well economically, usually by combination of corruption or bending the legal system in such a way that it benefits them, and while it damages the economy as a whole, it's pretty hard to imagine that they're going to voluntarily give up the ability to control their economies politically in order to make the country wealthier. I think this might be a little bit wishful thinking. But anyway, political will can change. We saw it change in China. We saw it change in India. It changes in other countries as well. It may take a revolution. It may take simply working through the political process incrementally over time. And maybe things will change. So anyway, this is all just at this point guesswork. We won't know until we actually get there. Now, what can the rich world do to help eliminate global poverty? As we've already pointed out, most rich nations, while they do contribute to third world nations, they contribute relatively little in the total scheme of things. Rich nations take care of their own people before they take care of others, and that's may not be noble, but it's certainly understandable. I believe rich families worry more about getting their kids into a fancy private college than they do in searching out some poor deserving kid to send to college, right? I presume everyone does that individually for their own family. Well, nations do the same thing as well. So like I said, whether it's a noble thing or not, this is simply a fact of life. I do not expect that we're going to make a major change in the total amount that rich nations can contribute in voluntary donations to poor nations. Now, what rich nations can do, however, is they can help nations solve their own problems, such as tackling corruption, lack of private property protection, lack of contract enforcement. There's a lot of things that we can do to pressure countries to move in that direction. Something you may want to look up is as I mentioned once before to you, there's a really nice index on the economic freedom. It's called the Economic Freedom of the World Index, that ranks countries by how much they use market mechanisms versus non-market mechanisms to get things done. There's also the corruption index, also known as the corruption perception index, that ranks countries around the world, and most of them are ranked by how corrupt they are. And you will find that the same thing pretty much exists. The less corrupt a nation is, generally speaking, the more wealth there is in the nation and the more broadly that wealth is distributed. So, and vice versa, the more corrupt a nation, we generally have a great deal of income inequality and the country is relatively poor. And right now, it's very unfortunate, but we have two of the most corrupt nations in the world, both Russia and Ukraine are highly corrupt nations, politically corrupt, and we're seeing that they're in a war right now, which of course is not necessarily related to their corruptness, but economically speaking, it just turns out to be that the two of them are highly corrupt, and both of them are relatively poor. The average income in Russia is close to what it is in Mexico, and the income in the nation of Ukraine is significantly below that. So by American standards, by German standards, European standards, even by South Korean standards, both Russia and the Ukraine are relatively poor. When the war in Ukraine finally ends, will Ukraine be able to move forward on cleaning up its corruption and try to move toward better economic and political systems? Well, they were trying. They want to move into the European Union, for instance, and of course Russia doesn't want them to be associated tightly with the European Union. So whether they will ever be able to do that on their own, it's hard to know. Again, we're stuck with that problem of we think we know what would work, but getting the political will to do it when political authority oftentimes benefits from the corruption, it's really hard to imagine how this could be done easily and quickly. But it has been done. It turns out that the vast majority of rich countries today were once corrupt at one time, with kings and nobles using their power to exploit people quite dramatically. Serfdom existed throughout all of Europe up until relatively recently. The serfs weren't even released from their serfdom and their servitude until the late 1800s. It was after the Civil War before the Russian serfs got their freedom. So we recognize that things do change over time. So there's, I think, strong reason to believe that in the long run, global poverty can be eliminated.